The reservation at Marcelli's had been made 3 weeks in advance, which wasn't unusual for a restaurant that charged $400 per person before you even looked at the wine list. But what made this particular Tuesday evening different was the amount of money riding on the dinner itself. Richard Caldwell stepped out of his town car onto the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan's Upper East Side, straightening his Tom Ford suit jacket as his driver held the umbrella over his head, and he felt that familiar rush of adrenaline that always came before closing a major deal. $8 million, that's what the contract was worth, and all he had to do was wine and dine the Yamamoto Corporation executives for a few hours, demonstrate his sophistication and cultural knowledge, and by the time dessert arrived, they'd be ready to sign on the dotted line. He'd built his reputation on these dinners, on his ability to navigate the social intricacies of international business, and his knowledge of wine had become something of a legend in Manhattan's financial circles. People called him the sommelier behind his back, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with derision, but always with a grudging respect for his encyclopedic knowledge of vintages, vineyards, and the subtle art of pairing wine with both food and conversation. He'd spent 20 years cultivating that knowledge, traveling to wine regions across France, Italy, Spain, and California, spending weekends at tastings and auctions, building a personal collection worth over $2 million in the climate-controlled cellar beneath his Tribeca penthouse. The Yamamoto executives were known for their appreciation of Western wine culture, and Richard had planned every detail of this evening to showcase his expertise, from the 2005 Chateau Margaux he'd pre-ordered for the main course to the 1990 Krug champagne that would accompany the dessert. As he walked through Marcelli's heavy oak doors into the warm glow of the dining room, he nodded to Antonio, the maitre d', who'd known him for 15 years, and always saved him the corner table with the view of the park. The restaurant was already filling up with Manhattan's elite, the soft murmur of expensive conversations floating over the clink of crystal and silver, and Richard felt perfectly at home in this world of carefully cultivated taste and barely concealed competition. His guests hadn't arrived yet, which gave him a few minutes to review his notes and settle into the performance he'd be giving all evening, because that's what these dinners were really, performances where every word and gesture was calculated to project success, confidence, and the kind of cultural sophistication that made people want to give you their money. He ordered a whiskey neat from the bar while he waited, something simple to start, and watched the staff move through their choreographed dance of service with the precision of Swiss clockwork. The wait staff at Marcelli's were trained to be invisible until needed, to anticipate every requirement before it was voiced, and Richard appreciated that kind of professionalism because it reflected his own approach to business. He noticed a new face among the servers, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the slightly nervous energy of someone still learning the rhythms of high-end service. She was carrying a tray of wine glasses to a nearby table, and he watched her set them down with careful precision, noting the way she double-checked the placement of each glass before moving on. New blood, he thought, probably working her way through graduate school or trying to break into the restaurant industry, the usual story you heard from servers in places like this. His phone buzzed with a text from Yamamoto's assistant confirming they were 5 minutes away, and Richard drained his whiskey, leaving the glass on the bar as he made his way to his table. Antonio appeared at his elbow like a well-dressed ghost, pulling out his chair and placing the wine list in front of him with a flourish that was just theatrical enough to be impressive without crossing into parody. Richard didn't need to look at the list because he'd already decided on his selections, but he opened it anyway, enjoying the weight of the leather-bound volume and the careful calligraphy that described each bottle's pedigree. This was his domain, his arena, and tonight he was going to remind everyone why they called him the sommelier. The Yamamoto executives arrived exactly on time, which Richard took as a good sign because punctuality in business was often a predictor of reliability in contracts, and he stood to greet them with the slight bow he'd learned was appropriate for Japanese business culture. Hiroshi Yamamoto was in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, with the kind of quiet authority that came from running a multi-billion-dollar electronics corporation for 30 years, and his two associates were younger men, who clearly served as both translators and advisors. The pleasantries were exchanged in that careful mixture of English and Japanese that characterized international business, and they settled into their seats as Antonio distributed menus and water glasses with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Richard launched into his opening gambit, discussing the restaurant's history and his own long relationship with Marcelli's, establishing his credentials as an insider, someone who belonged in these rarefied spaces, and he could see Yamamoto nodding slightly in appreciation. When Antonio returned to discuss wine selections, Richard was ready, dismissing the sommelier with a polite wave and announcing that he would handle the wine service himself, as he always did at Marcelli, and he saw the flicker of amusement in Yamamoto's eyes that told him the gesture had landed exactly as intended. Richard Caldwell had perfected his wine presentation over 2 decades of business dinners, and he delivered it now with the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about a vintage in his entire life, which wasn't entirely true, but was the impression he'd carefully cultivated. He started with the champagne, explaining that they would begin with a 2008 Dom Perignon, because the year was significant in both wine history and in the founding of Yamamoto's North American division, a connection he'd researched specifically for this dinner, and he watched Yamamoto's eyebrows rise slightly in recognition of the gesture. The art of the business dinner wasn't just about food and drink, it was about storytelling, about weaving together threads of shared experience and mutual interest until your clients felt like they were part of something exclusive and important. He moved through his selections with practiced ease, explaining that the first course of oysters would be accompanied by a crisp Chablis, specifically a 2019 Domaine William Fevre, because the limestone soil of Chablis created a minerality that perfectly complemented the breeness of fresh oysters, and while this was wine pairing, the way he delivered the information made it sound like insider knowledge. For the main course he'd selected that 2005 Chateau Margaux he'd been planning, one of the greatest Bordeaux vintages of the century, and he spent 5 minutes discussing the weather conditions that year, in the Medoc region, the perfect balance of rain and sunshine that had produced grapes of extraordinary concentration and complexity. Yamamoto was listening intently now, asking questions about the aging potential of the wine, and whether Richard thought it had reached its peak drinking window, and Richard felt the conversation shift into that comfortable space where business and pleasure merged seamlessly. This was what he was good at, this performance of expertise and sophistication that made clients feel like they were in capable hands, and if they trusted his judgment about wine, they would trust his judgment about business contracts. The younger Yamamoto associates were taking notes on their phones, either about the wine or about Richard himself, and he made sure to include them in the conversation, asking about their own experiences with wine and Japanese sake, demonstrating the kind of inclusive leadership style that played well in international business. Antonio appeared to take their orders, and Richard noticed that new waitress hovering at the edge of their section, watching the more experienced servers work while trying to stay out of the way, and he felt a moment of superiority, knowing that she was probably intimidated by a table like his, where the wine selection alone would cost more than she made in a month. The oysters arrived on beds of crushed ice, arranged like precious gems on the gleaming platters, and the Chablis was poured with ceremonial precision, the golden liquid catching the light as it filled the crystal glasses. Richard went through the tasting ritual, swirling the wine, inhaling its bouquet, taking a small sip and letting it coat his palate before nodding his approval, even though he'd already known the wine would be perfect because he'd ordered from this specific vintage and vineyard dozens of times before. Yamamoto followed his lead, and Richard could see the appreciation in the older man's eyes as he tasted the wine, that moment of pleasure that comes from experiencing something truly excellent, and Richard knew he was winning. They ate and talked, discussing market trends and production schedules, but always returning to the wine because Richard had made wine the central thread of the evening's narrative, the thing that bound them together in shared appreciation of quality and refinement. When the sommelier, a young man named Marcus whom Richard had known for years, brought out the Chateau Margaux for his inspection, Richard made a show of examining the bottle, checking the label for authenticity, feeling the weight of it in his hands like it was a newborn child. He'd told this story dozens of times, about how you could spot a fake Bordeaux by the weight of the glass and the specific font used on the label in different years, and his guests leaned in to hear these details, treating his words like secrets being shared among initiates. The cork was pulled with a satisfying pop, and Marcus poured a small amount for Richard to taste, but before Richard could go through his tasting ritual, he launched into another story, this one about visiting Chateau Margaux itself 5 years ago, meeting the winemaker, walking through the cellars where bottles from the 19th century still lay aging in the cool darkness. He described the smell of the oak barrels, the way the light filtered through the high windows of the chateau, painting a picture so vivid that his guests could almost taste the wine before it touched their lips. And this was the real art of it, not just knowing wine but knowing how to make wine into an experience, memory they would associate with him and this dinner, and ultimately with the business deal they were about to sign. He finally tasted the wine, letting it rest on his tongue, identifying the notes of blackcurrant and cedar, and just a hint of tobacco, pronouncing it perfect, and nodding for Marcus to pour for the table. The main courses arrived, massive ribeye steaks for Richard and Yamamoto, Chilean sea bass for the associates, each plate a masterpiece of culinary architecture that justified the restaurant's astronomical prices, and as they began to eat, Richard guided the conversation toward the contract, mentioning profit margins and delivery schedules between bites of perfectly cooked beef. This was the delicate part, the transition from social occasion to business negotiation, and he'd learned over the years that the key was to make it seem natural, inevitable, as if signing the contract was just the logical conclusion to an evening of shared pleasure and mutual respect. Yamamoto was nodding along, his initial reserve melting away under the influence of excellent food and wine, and Richard could feel the deal coming together, could sense that by the end of the evening they would have reached an agreement in principle if not in signed documents. Sarah Mitchell had been working at Marcelli's for exactly 2 weeks, and every shift felt like walking through a minefield where the mines were made of crystal and cost more than her car, which was saying something because her car barely ran anymore, coughing black smoke every time she turned the ignition. She'd gotten the job through her roommate's boyfriend who knew someone in the manager's office, and the money was better than any of her previous waitressing gigs, but the stress level was astronomical, because these weren't the kind of customers who forgave mistakes or appreciated effort. They expected perfection, and anything less was met with the kind of cold disdain that made you question your entire existence. Tonight she'd been assigned to shadow Marcus, the senior sommelier, learning the intricacies of wine service at the highest level, and she'd spent most of the evening trying to stay invisible while absorbing everything she could about how to hold a bottle, how to pour without dripping, how to read a table's mood and anticipate their needs before they knew they had them. She'd noticed the businessman at table 7 immediately, not just because of the expensive suit or the way he commanded attention, but because of the way he'd dismissed Marcus when it came time to discuss wine, taking over the selection himself with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. She'd heard about guys like this, the self-proclaimed wine experts who treated restaurants like their personal stages, performing their knowledge for audiences of impressed clients and intimidated waitstaff, and usually the best policy was to stay out of their way and let them have their moment. But then she'd seen the bottle Marcus had brought out for the main course, the Chateau Margaux, and something about it had bothered her immediately, a nagging feeling in the back of her mind that she couldn't quite place. She'd grown up in Napa Valley. Her father had worked as a vineyard manager for 30 years before he died, and she'd spent her childhood surrounded by wine in a way that had nothing to do with expensive restaurants and everything to do with the actual labor of growing grapes and making wine. Her knowledge wasn't theoretical or performative, it was practical and earned through years of helping her father in the vineyards, learning to identify problems with soil drainage and pest infestations, and 1,000 other things that could ruin a harvest, and somewhere in that childhood she'd developed an eye for details that others missed. The label on that Chateau Margaux was wrong, she was almost certain of it. Something about the spacing of the text or the shade of cream used for the background paper, and she'd spent the last 10 minutes trying to convince herself she was wrong because the alternative was terrifying. If she was right, then this table was about to drink a fake bottle of wine that probably cost thousands of dollars, and if she said something and was wrong, she'd be fired on the spot for embarrassing a valued customer and questioning the restaurant's wine selection. Her hands were shaking slightly as she pretended to organize wine glasses at the service station, watching the businessman hold forth about the wine while Marcus poured it into their glasses, and she knew she had maybe 60 seconds before they started drinking and her opportunity to speak up would be gone forever. Marcus caught her eye as he finished pouring and walked back toward the wine cellar, and she made a split-second decision that would either save her job or end following him into the back hallway where the lighting was harsh and fluorescent and the pretense of elegance gave way to the utilitarian reality of restaurant operation. She explained her suspicion in a rushed whisper, describing the specific details of the label that seemed wrong, and Marcus's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned as he pulled out his phone and started searching for images of authentic Chateau Margaux. They compared the bottle to the images, zooming in on the font and the chateau's crest and the specific way the year was printed, and Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized she was right. The bottle was a fake, probably a decent fake that would fool most people, but still unmistakably wrong once you knew what to look for. Marcus swore under his breath, a creative string of Italian profanity that would have been funny under different circumstances, and explained that they needed to handle this delicately, because Table 7 was Richard Caldwell, a regular customer who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars at the restaurant every year, and whose ego was as large as his bank account. The plan they came up with in 30 seconds of hurried consultation was simple. Marcus would approach the table and quietly explain the situation to Antonio, who would then speak privately with Caldwell, offering to replace the bottle at no charge and apologizing for the error, because even though the fake bottle had come from their supplier and wasn't technically their fault, the customer was always right in establishments like Marcelli's. Sarah was supposed to stay in the back and let the senior staff handle it, but as she watched Marcus walk back toward the dining room, she felt that familiar stubbornness that had gotten her in trouble her entire life, the inability to stay quiet when she knew something important, and before she could talk herself out of it, she was following Marcus back onto the floor. She approached Table 7 just as Caldwell was raising his glass to his lips, preparing to taste the wine he'd been praising for the last 5 minutes, and she heard her own voice cutting through the refined murmur of the dining room with embarrassing clarity. "Excuse me, sir, but I need to speak with you about that wine." The businessman lowered his glass and turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was everything Sarah had feared it would be, a mixture of annoyance and disbelief that this young waitress would dare interrupt his performance. And she saw the Japanese executives exchange glances that suggested they were wondering if this was some kind of test or elaborate joke. Richard Caldwell felt the irritation flash through him like electricity, hot and immediate, because this was not part of the script he'd so carefully written for the evening, and interruptions during business dinners were the kind of amateur mistake that could derail hours of careful relationship building. He set his wine glass down with controlled precision, a kind of deliberate movement that communicated displeasure without saying a word, and fixed the young waitress with the stare he usually reserved for incompetent junior analysts who'd made critical errors in important presentations. "I'm sorry, what?" His voice was quiet but carried an edge that made nearby diners glance over, sensing drama in the making, because there was something about conflict in expensive restaurants that drew attention the way car accidents drew rubberneckers on highways. The waitress, whose name tag identified her as Sarah, didn't back down the way he'd expected, didn't apologize and scurry away with her tail between her legs, and that unexpected resistance only increased his annoyance, because he'd been in complete control of this evening, until 30 seconds ago. "The wine, sir, I think there might be an issue with the bottle." She was nervous. He could see that in the way her hands fidgeted with her order pad and the slight tremor in her voice, but there was also a stubborn determination in her eyes that suggested she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Antonio materialized at the edge of the table, his expression apologetic, and Richard could see Marcus the sommelier hovering behind him, and suddenly this wasn't just an interruption anymore, it was becoming a situation that threatened to undermine everything he'd built this evening. "Mr. Caldwell, if we could speak privately for just a moment," Antonio began, but Richard cut him off with a sharp gesture, because he could feel Yamamoto watching him, evaluating how he handled this unexpected challenge, and backing down or appearing uncertain would damage his carefully cultivated image of absolute confidence. "No, Antonio, if there's an issue with the wine I selected, I think we should address it here now." He picked up his glass again, swirling the deep red liquid, inhaling its bouquet with exaggerated care, making a show of his expertise. "This is a 2005 Chateau Margaux, one of the finest Bordeaux vintages in recent history, and I can assure everyone at this table that it is absolutely authentic and perfect." He took a sip, letting the wine rest on his palate, and made a show of savoring it before swallowing. Notes of blackcurrant, cedar, and tobacco with a silky tannin structure that indicates perfect aging conditions, exactly as I expected from this vintage and vineyard. The waitress didn't move, didn't apologize, and that stubborn set to her jaw reminded him uncomfortably of his own daughter, who'd inherited his determination along with his grey eyes, and had spent most of her teenage years arguing with him about everything from politics to music to his parenting style. "Sir, with respect, the label is wrong." Her voice was steadier now, as if she'd made a decision to commit fully to this confrontation regardless of the consequence. "The font spacing on the Chateau crest is incorrect for a 2005 bottle, and the shade of the label paper is too bright. The authentic labels from that year used a darker cream color." Richard felt a moment of uncertainty, not because he believed she was right, but because the specificity of her criticism suggested she wasn't just making things up, and doubt was a dangerous thing in situations like this. He glanced at Yamamoto, who was watching the exchange with interest rather than irritation, which was either very good or very bad depending on how this played out. "Are you seriously suggesting that I, someone who has been collecting and studying wine for 20 years, cannot identify an authentic bottle of Chateau Margaux?" His voice rose slightly, enough that more diners were turning to watch now, and he saw Antonio wince because scenes in restaurants like this were bad for business. Marcus stepped forward with a tablet, and Richard's stomach sank because he suddenly realized this wasn't going to end the way he wanted it to. "Miss Caldwell, we've compared the bottle to authenticate examples, and I'm afraid Sarah is correct. The label is inconsistent with genuine 2005 Margaux bottles in several specific ways." The sommelier's voice was professionally apologetic but firm, and Richard felt the ground shifting beneath him like sand in an earthquake. The Yamamoto executives were leaning forward now, examining the bottle themselves, and Richard knew he was at a critical decision point. He could either admit the error gracefully, or double down on his expertise, and risk being proven definitively wrong. His pride, that same pride that had driven him to the top of his industry and made him millions of dollars, screamed at him to double down, to maintain his position, to never show weakness or uncertainty in front of clients. "This is ridiculous. I've purchased dozens of bottles from this vintage. I know what an authentic Margaux looks like, and I'm telling you this bottle is genuine." He heard the edge of desperation in his own voice and hated himself for it, but he'd built his entire reputation on his wine knowledge, and if he admitted error now, especially in front of Yamamoto, it would undermine everything he'd established over the past 2 hours. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through images with quick practiced movements that suggested she'd done this research recently. "Here, this is an authenticated 2005 Chateau Margaux label from the Chateau's own archives. You can see the font weight on the year is heavy, and the Chateau crest has more detail in the stonework. And look at the bottom edge of the label. There should be a subtle watermark that's not present on your bottle." She held the phone out, and Richard found himself looking at the image despite his resistance, and the evidence was undeniable once you knew what to look for. The difference is subtle but definitive. The silence that fell over table 7 was the kind of silence that precedes explosions or earthquakes, heavy with potential energy and terrible inevitability, and Richard Caldwell felt his carefully constructed evening crumbling around him, like a sand castle hit by an unexpected wave. He stared at the image on the waitress's phone, comparing it to the bottle in front of him, and the differences that she'd pointed out were now impossible to ignore, glaring inconsistencies that screamed fraud once you knew to look for them. The font weight was wrong, the crest lacked detail, the label paper was too bright, and most damning of all was the absence of that watermark, a security feature that Chateau Margaux had introduced in 2004 to combat the growing problem of counterfeit wines flooding the market. He'd been praising a fake bottle, performing his expertise while serving his important clients wine that was probably worth $20 rather than the thousands he'd thought, and the humiliation of that realization hit him like a physical blow. Antonio was already moving into damage control mode, his voice low and soothing as he assured everyone that the restaurant would immediately provide authentic replacement bottles at no charge, that they would be investigating their supplier, that this had never happened before in Marcelli's 40-year history. But Richard barely heard him because he was too busy watching his reflection in the dark window, seeing himself as his clients must see him now, a man whose confidence had been exposed as arrogance, whose expertise had been proven fallible by a 20-something waitress with a phone and better knowledge than his expensive education had provided. Yamamoto set down his wine glass very carefully, and Richard recognized the gesture from their earlier negotiations, the way the older man created deliberate pauses before important statements, and he braced himself for whatever was coming. Mr. Caldwell, this is a very interesting development, and I think it teaches us something important about the nature of expertise and humility in business relationships. The Japanese executive's English was precise and formal, each word chosen with care, and Richard couldn't tell if he was being criticized or complimented or something in between. In Japan, we have a saying, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down," which can mean many things, but one interpretation is that overconfidence often precedes error, and the wise person remains open to correction from any source. The younger associates were nodding, and Richard realized with a sinking feeling that this moment was going to become part of Yamamoto's decision-making process, a test of character he hadn't known he was taking. He could feel the other diners watching now, whispers spreading through the restaurant like ripples in a pond, and he knew that by tomorrow this story would be circulating through Manhattan's financial district, another cautionary tale about hubris and comeuppance. The waitress, Sarah, was still standing there looking uncomfortable now that her intervention had caused such a scene, and Richard felt a flash of anger toward her that he recognized as irrational and unfair because she'd been right. She'd saved him from serving fake wine to important clients, which would have been far worse if discovered after they'd finished the bottle. Marcus was explaining the technical details of wine counterfeiting to Yamamoto, discussing the sophisticated operations that produced these fakes, bottles that could fool all but the most careful inspection. And Richard listened to his own sommelier deliver the explanation that he should have been able to provide if his ego hadn't gotten in the way. The truth that he was starting to understand, slowly and painfully like waking up from surgery, was that his knowledge had always been more performance than substance, more about impressing others than genuine expertise, and he'd built an entire professional identity on foundations of sand. He'd visited vineyards and attended tastings and read books, but he'd never actually worked with wine the way this waitress clearly had, never developed the kind of practical knowledge that comes from labor and attention rather than tourism and consumption. Her father had been a vineyard manager, someone who'd mentioned casually, and that single fact represented decades of hands-on experience that Richard's expensive hobby could never match. He looked at the bottle again, this fraudulent representation of excellence that he'd been praising minutes earlier, and felt something shift inside him, a crack in the armor of certainty he'd worn for so long. "I apologize," he heard himself say, the words coming out before he'd consciously decided to speak them, addressing not just his clients but the table as a whole, the waitress, the sommelier, even Antonio, who was still hovering anxiously. "I was wrong about the wine, and more importantly, I was wrong to dismiss Sarah's concerns without listening to her evidence. My ego got in the way of good judgment, which is a mistake I make too often in business as well as in wine." Yamamoto's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile but something warmer than the neutral professionalism he'd maintained all evening, and Richard recognized that he'd somehow stumbled into the right response, admitting error with genuine humility rather than making excuses or deflecting blame. Sarah looked surprised, her defensive posture relaxing slightly, and Richard realized she'd expected him to be angry at her, to blame her for the embarrassment, which was probably what most men in his position would have done. Marcus brought out a different bottle, this one with authentication papers from the chateau itself, and the examination process this time included all of them, Richard and Yamamoto, and even Sarah, comparing the new label to the images on her phone and confirming every detail before Marcus pulled the cork.
The authentic Chateau Margaux, when it was finally poured and tasted, was noticeably different from the counterfeit they'd almost consumed, and Richard Caldwell felt the difference, not just in the wine itself, but in his entire approach to the tasting, because this time he wasn't performing for an audience, he was actually paying attention to what he was experiencing. The complexity was extraordinary, layers of flavor unfolding across his palate in ways the fake had only approximated, and he found himself genuinely appreciating the wine rather than cataloging its properties for the benefit of observers. Sarah had been invited to sit down at their table, Antonio insisting, despite her protests, that she needed to get back to work, and Richard found himself asking her questions about her father's vineyard work, about the practical realities of wine production that he'd always observed from a distance. She explained how her father had taught her to identify problems with grapevines by examining the color and texture of the leaves, how different soil types produced different mineral characteristics in the finished wine, how the angle of sun exposure on a hillside could determine whether grapes developed the right balance of sugar and acidity. This was knowledge earned through years of manual labor and careful observation, and Richard recognized that it was more valuable than anything he'd learned from books or tasting notes. Yamamoto was asking questions too, clearly fascinated by this unexpected turn the evening had taken, and Richard realized that the deal wasn't ruined by his mistake. If anything, it was being strengthened by the authenticity of this moment, the dropping of professional masks in favor of genuine human interaction. In my company, we have a practice called Genchi Genbutsu, which means go and see for yourself, the principle that real understanding comes from direct observation and hands-on experience rather than reports and second-hand information, Yamamoto explained, his formal English warming as the conversation shifted from business posturing to actual dialogue. I think this is what your father taught you, Sarah, and what Mr. Caldwell perhaps needs to remember in his own business practice. The criticism was gentle but clear, and Richard accepted it because it was true. He'd spent his career delegating the actual work of investigation and analysis to subordinates while he focused on presentations and relationship management, and somewhere along the way he'd started believing his own performances, mistaking confidence for competence. Sarah was talking about the growing problem of counterfeit wines, explaining that her father had warned her about it years ago, describing how organized crime operations had infiltrated the wine supply chain at every level, from fake bottles and labels to sophisticated chemical analyses of famous wines that allowed counterfeiters to create blends that could fool casual tasters. The scale of the problem was staggering, millions of dollars in fake wines circulating through auction houses and restaurants and private collections, and Richard felt a cold shock as he wondered how many bottles in his own $2 million collection might be fraudulent. Marcus was explaining that Marcelli's would be implementing new authentication procedures, working directly with chateaus and vineyards to verify provenance, and Richard found himself suggesting resources and contacts from his own collection network, offering to help rather than protect his ego. The main courses had grown cold during all this drama, and Antonio ordered new plates prepared while they continued talking, and the conversation ranged from wine to business to family history. Yamamoto sharing stories about his grandfather's sake brewery in Kyoto, and Richard finding himself talking about his own father, a factory worker who'd never tasted wine in his life, and would have been baffled by his son's obsession with. There was something liberating about dropping the performance, about admitting limitations and mistakes, and Richard felt layers of professional armor falling away to reveal the actual person underneath, someone who'd been hiding for so long he'd almost forgotten what genuine conversation felt like. Sarah mentioned that she was studying viticulture at NYU, working toward a degree that would let her run her own vineyard someday, carrying on her father's legacy in a way that honored his practical knowledge while adding academic credentials, and Richard found himself offering to introduce her to contacts in the wine industry, people who could provide internships and mentorship. Yamamoto was nodding approvingly, and Richard realized that this gesture, this willingness to help someone who'd just embarrassed him publicly, was worth more in the Japanese executive's eyes than any amount of wine expertise. Mr. Caldwell, I think this evening has shown me something important about your character, specifically your ability to accept correction and learn from mistakes, which is a quality I value highly in business partners, Yamamoto said carefully, choosing his words with diplomatic precision. The wine knowledge is impressive, but the willingness to admit error and treat everyone with respect regardless of their position, this is what makes me confident in moving forward with our contract. Richard felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying, because he'd been certain the deal was dead, killed by his arrogance and the exposure of his fallible expertise, but somehow the disaster had transformed into opportunity. They talked through the contract details over their reheated main courses, and this time the discussion was more honest, more direct, without the layers of performance and posturing that had characterized Richard's usual business dinners, and he found the straightforward negotiation more satisfying than his carefully choreographed presentations had ever been.
The Yamamoto executives departed at 11:30, handshakes and promises to have contracts finalized by the end of the week, and Richard Caldwell found himself still sitting at table 7 with Sarah Mitchell, surrounded by empty wine glasses and the debris of a meal that had cost more than most people spent on rent. Antonio had given up trying to close their section and had instead brought them coffee and small plates of the kitchen's experimental dessert, the things the pastry chef was developing for next season's menu, and they'd been talking for 2 hours about wine and family and the strange paths that lead people to their current positions in life. Sarah had explained how she'd ended up in New York after her father died, needing to escape Napa Valley because every vineyard reminded her of him, every bottle of wine a memorial to the man who'd taught her everything she knew about grapes and soil and the patience required to create something excellent. She'd been working her way through graduate school with waitressing jobs, this being the latest and most lucrative, but her real goal was to return to California eventually and buy a small vineyard where she could implement the sustainable farming practices her father had pioneered decades before the wine industry discovered the marketing value of onic and biodynamic production. Richard found himself sharing details of his own life that he rarely discussed, talking about the insecurity that drove his need to be the expert in every room, the way his father's working-class background had made him desperate to prove he belonged among Manhattan's elite, the fear that underneath all his expensive education and cultural sophistication he was still just a factory worker's son playing dress-up. Sarah listened without judgment, asking questions that suggested she understood the psychology of imposter syndrome because she'd experienced it herself, every day in this restaurant where she served people who spent more on a single meal than she made in a week. The conversation turned to the counterfeit wine problem, and Richard pulled out his phone to show her his collection inventory, thousands of bottles organized by region and vintage, and they spent an hour going through it together, Sarah identifying several bottles that had the same warning signs as the fake Margaux, subtle inconsistencies in labels or provenance that suggested they might not be authentic. The potential loss was staggering, possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars in bottles that Richard had purchased at auctions or through private dealers, and he felt that sick feeling of violated trust that comes from discovering you've been systematically deceived. But there was also something oddly satisfying about identifying the problems, about applying actual knowledge rather than just confident assumptions, and Sarah's expertise was saving him from future embarrassment and financial loss. He found himself making an offer without fully thinking through the implications, asking if she would be interested in authenticating his entire collection, offering to pay her consulting rates that would probably cover a semester of graduate school, and her eyes widened in surprise before a smile spread across her face. "Are you seriously offering me a job because I embarrassed you in front of your clients?" Her tone was teasing but also genuinely curious, trying to understand his motivation. "I'm offering you a job because you saved me from a much bigger embarrassment, and because you know things I don't, which is apparently something I need to get more comfortable acknowledging," Richard replied, and he meant because the evening had taught him that his greatest weakness wasn't lack of knowledge, but the inability to admit that lack and learn from people who knew better. They exchanged contact information, making plans to meet at his apartment the following week to begin the authentication process, and Sarah mentioned that she knew other experts who could help with specialized regions, people from her graduate program who'd grown up in Burgundy or Tuscany or the Rhone Valley and had the kind of embedded knowledge that came from generations of family involvement in wine production. Richard realized he was building something different from his usual business relationships, something based on mutual respect and genuine expertise rather than networking and social performance, and it felt both uncomfortable and exciting in equal measure. Marcus appeared with the check, and Richard waved away Sarah's offer to split it, because even though the evening had demolished his ego, it hadn't changed the fact that he could easily afford a $4,000 dinner while she was working multiple jobs to pay for school. He left a tip that was probably larger than her monthly wages, not as a gesture of superiority but as a genuine thank you for the correction that had saved his business deal, and possibly taught him something important about humility and learning. They walked out of Marcelli's together into the cool Manhattan night, and Richard offered her a ride home in his town car, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation, giving his driver an address in Brooklyn that was clearly not one of the borough's gentrified neighborhoods. During the drive through mostly empty streets, they continued talking, and Richard found himself describing the $8 million contract that had been riding on the evening's dinner, explaining how close he'd come to destroying the deal through his own arrogance. 6 months after that disastrous dinner at Marcelli's, Richard Caldwell stood in his climate-controlled wine cellar watching Sarah Mitchell, work through his collection with the systematic thoroughness of a forensic investigator, and he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since the night she'd corrected him in front of his most important clients. The authentication project had revealed that nearly 30% of his $2 million collection was counterfeit, a devastating discovery that had forced him to completely reevaluate his approach to both wine collecting and business in general, because if he could be fooled so thoroughly in his supposed area of expertise, what other mistakes was he making out of arrogance and overconfidence? Sarah had brought in a team of graduate students and wine professionals, creating a consulting business that was now authenticating collections for wealthy clients across Manhattan, and Richard had become her partner in the venture, providing capital and business connections while she provided the actual expertise. The Yamamoto contract had closed successfully, $8 million that had funded Richard's company's expansion into Asian markets, and Hiroshi Yamamoto had told him privately that his willingness to accept correction from a waitress had been the deciding factor in trusting him as a business partner. That moment of humility had apparently demonstrated character that all the wine knowledge and expensive dinners couldn't convey, and Richard had carried that lesson into other aspects of his business, learning to listen more and perform less, to value actual expertise over confident assertions, to build teams of people who knew more than he did, rather than surrounding himself with yes-men who reinforced his assumptions. His relationship with Sarah had evolved into a genuine friendship, and she'd become something like a younger sister, someone who wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, and who had no problem calling him out when he slipped back into his old habits of arrogant assumption. She'd introduced him to her world, the working-class restaurants and wine bars where industry people gathered after their shifts, places where the focus was on the actual quality of wine rather than its price or prestige, and he'd discovered a community of passionate experts who'd been invisible to him when he was performing expertise from the heights of Manhattan's finest establishments. His own wine collecting had changed too, becoming less about acquisition and status, and more about genuine appreciation and learning, and he'd sold off most of his authenticated collection to fund Sarah's business expansion, keeping only the bottles that had real meaning or represented wines he actually wanted to drink rather than just own. The counterfeit wines he'd discovered had been turned over to law enforcement, becoming part of a larger investigation into international wine fraud that had made headlines when several major auction houses were implicated in selling fake bottles, and Richard's willingness to admit his own deception had protected him from legal liability, while establishing him as an advocate for authentication reform in the industry. Sarah's graduate thesis had become a comprehensive study of counterfeit wine detection, combining chemical analysis with traditional authentication methods, and Richard had arranged for her to present it at industry conferences, where her practical knowledge and academic credentials made her an increasingly respected voice. She'd been offered positions at several prestigious auction houses and wine merchants, but she'd turned them all down because she was still planning to return to California eventually and buy that vineyard where she could honor her father's legacy. Richard had been thinking about that plan a lot lately, considering whether he might invest in it, not as a silent partner or wealthy benefactor, but as someone who actually learned the business of grape growing and wine production from the ground up, getting his hands dirty in ways his expensive hobby had never required. The idea terrified him because it would mean leaving behind the identity he'd spent 30 years constructing, abandoning the Manhattan financial world where he'd made his reputation and fortune, but it also excited him in ways that business deals and wine auctions no longer did. He'd turned 50 last month, and the milestone had prompted uncomfortable questions about how he wanted to spend the second half of his life, whether he wanted to continue performing expertise and chasing deals, or whether he wanted to actually learn something real and meaningful, even if it meant starting over as a beginner. Sarah finished examining a case of supposed Burgundy, making notes on her tablet with efficient speed, and looked up with that expression he'd learned meant she'd found more fakes. These are good counterfeits, really sophisticated. They would fool most people, including auction house experts. But the cork stamps are wrong for the years claimed, and the labels have the same watermark issues we saw with that Margot, she explained, and Richard felt the familiar combination of disappointment and gratitude. Disappointed that more of his collection was fraudulent, but grateful that Sarah's knowledge was saving him from continued deception. They worked through the remaining cases together, and Richard found satisfaction in the methodical process of investigation and verification using tools and techniques that Sarah had taught him over months of collaboration, and he realized that he was actually learning wine knowledge now rather than just accumulating impressive facts to deploy in conversation. The vineyard was called Esperanza, which Sarah explained meant hope in Spanish, and it sat on 40 acres of hillside in Sonoma County, with views that stretched across valleys of grapevines to mountains in the distance, and Richard Caldwell felt something shift in his chest as he stood there, in the early morning light, trying to imagine himself as someone who grew grapes rather than just collected the finished product. The property had been on the market for 6 months, the previous owner having died without heirs, and Sarah had brought Richard to see it, because she thought it had potential. The soil composition was excellent, the sun exposure ideal, and the existing vines were old enough to produce grapes of real character, if properly managed. The asking price was reasonable by Manhattan real estate standards, although it represented every dollar Sarah had saved plus substantial loans, and she'd invited Richard to be a partner in the purchase not because she needed his money, but because she thought the project might save him from becoming the kind of bitter, isolated, wealthy person who'd lost touch with everything that made life meaningful. They'd been walking the property for 2 hours, Sarah explaining the work that would need to be done, the irrigation systems that needed updating, the pest management protocols they'd need to implement, the years of patient labor required before they'd produce wine good enough to sell, and Richard had listened with the kind of attention he usually reserved for major business deals, because this was a major deal, possibly the most important decision he'd made since leaving his father's working-class neighborhood for college 30 years ago. His business partners thought he was insane, talking about leaving Manhattan to become a farmer, and his ex-wife had called it a midlife crisis that he'd regret once the romantic fantasy collided with the brutal reality of agricultural work. But Richard had spent the last 6 months studying viticulture with the same obsessive energy he'd once devoted to collecting wine, taking courses at UC Davis, working harvest seasons at other vineyards to understand the physical labor involved, and he'd discovered that he loved the work in ways he'd never loved finance and deal-making. There was something deeply satisfying about labor that produced tangible results, about working with natural systems that operated on their own timelines regardless of human ambition, about the patience required to nurture vines that wouldn't produce their best fruit for years. Sarah was explaining her vision for the vineyard, talking about sustainable farming practices and minimal intervention in the winemaking process, creating wines that expressed the specific character of this particular hillside rather than trying to imitate famous French chateaux. And Richard found himself nodding along because her approach made sense in ways that his collecting had never quite achieved. They walked down to the barn that would serve as a winery, examining the Torquic fermentation tanks and oak barrels left by the previous owner, discussing what equipment they'd need to purchase and what could be salvaged. And Richard felt that familiar excitement that came at the beginning of new ventures, but this time it was grounded in realistic understanding of the challenges rather than arrogant assumptions about his abilities. His phone buzzed with messages from his office in Manhattan, urgent matters that required his attention, and he glanced at the screen before putting it away unanswered, because whatever crisis was unfolding in the world of international finance seemed less important than this moment standing in a barn in California, trying to decide whether to completely upend his life. Sarah was watching him with that knowing expression she'd developed over their 6-month partnership, reading his hesitation and uncertainty, and she spoke before he could voice his doubts. "You know this is going to be harder than anything you've done before, right? We'll be working 70-hour weeks during harvest, dealing with weather and pests and all the 1,000 things that can go wrong when you're trying to make something real rather than just shuffling money around." Her tone was challenging but not unkind, making sure he understood what he was signing up for. "I know," Richard replied, and he did know, had spent months preparing himself for exactly this reality, but knowing intellectually and experiencing physically were different things, and he suspected the first harvest season would test him in ways his comfortable Manhattan life never had. "I think that's exactly why I need to do this, because everything else has become too easy, too much about performance and not enough about actually creating something worthwhile." They stood in the barn discussing the practical details of partnership, drawing up agreements on Sarah's tablet that would need proper legal documentation later, but established the basic framework now: 50-50 ownership with decisions made jointly and profits split equally, a true partnership rather than the usual dynamic where Richard's money gave him control. Sarah insisted on provisions that would allow her to buy him out if he decided after a few years that farming wasn't for him, protecting her father's legacy from becoming just another rich man's abandoned hobby. And Richard agreed because the clauses were fair and because her skepticism about his commitment was justified, given how dramatically he was pivoting from his established life. 2 years after purchasing Esperanza Vineyard, Richard Caldwell stood among the vines at 4:30 in the morning, watching the harvest crew arrive in the pre-dawn darkness, and his hands were already sore from the previous day's work, his back aching from the constant bending and lifting that grape harvest required, and he'd never been happier in his entire life. The transformation had been brutal and humbling and absolutely necessary, stripping away the sophisticated Manhattan businessman to reveal someone he barely recognized, someone whose hands were calloused from manual labor, and whose knowledge came from direct experience rather than expensive education. Sarah had been right about everything. The work was harder than he'd imagined, the setbacks more frequent and devastating, the progress slower and more incremental than his business career had prepared him for, but there was a satisfaction in it that his old life had never provided. The first year had been a disaster by conventional measures, learning to actually manage vines rather than just admire them, dealing with a late frost that had damaged 30% of their crop, discovering that his theoretical knowledge meant nothing when faced with the practical reality of pest infestations and irrigation failures. Sarah had been patient with his mistakes but uncompromising in her standards, making him redo work when he'd taken shortcuts, teaching him the difference between knowing about wine and actually making it, and slowly over months of repetitive labor he'd developed genuine competence rather than performed expertise. They'd hired a small crew of experienced farm work people who knew more about viticulture than Richard had learned in 2 years of intensive study, and he'd had to swallow his pride and take direction from employees who were technically working for him, learning to value their expertise rather than assert his authority. The vineyard had become his education in humility, teaching him daily lessons about patience and attention to detail and the limitations of human control over natural systems, and he'd discovered that real mastery required years of patient observation rather than quick acquisition of impressive facts. The grapes they'd harvested yesterday had been perfect, hitting the exact balance of sugar and acidity that Sarah had been monitoring for weeks, and the first batch was already fermenting in the barn, beginning its transformation from fruit to wine, through processes that were both simple and mysteriously complex. Richard had spent hours yesterday pressing great physical labor, leaving him exhausted but satisfied in ways his old business deals never had, and he'd called his office in Manhattan to tell them he wouldn't be returning, selling his stake in the company to his partners, and committing fully to this new life. Sarah had been surprised by the decision even though she'd been hoping for it, understanding that true partnership required equal commitment rather than Richard treating the vineyard as a wealthy man's hobby while maintaining his real life elsewhere. They'd celebrated last night with a bottle from their first vintage, a modest wine that wasn't going to win any awards, but represented their actual achievement, proof that they could take grapes from their hillside and turn them into something drinkable and honest. The taste had been revelatory not because the wine was exceptional but because Richard could identify every stage of its creation, knew which vines the grapes had come from, remembered the weather conditions during that growing season, understood the decisions they'd made during fermentation and aging that had shaped its final character. This was the knowledge he'd been performing for years in Manhattan restaurants, but now it was real, earned through labor and attention rather than acquired through books and tastings, and the difference was everything. As the sky lightened and the harvest crew began working through the rows of vines, Richard took his position among them, filling buckets with careful attention to selecting only the best fruit. And he thought about that dinner at Marcelli's 2 years ago when a young waitress had corrected his arrogant assumptions and accidentally saved his life. Sarah was working 3 rows over, and he caught her eye and they exchanged smiles that contained all the shared history of this unlikely partnership, the way a single moment of humiliation had transformed into something neither of them could have predicted. The $8 million deal that had seemed so important that night was just business now, money that had funded expansion and created jobs but hadn't changed anything fundamental about who he was, while this vineyard, this work, these grapes being harvested in the early morning light, these had changed everything. Richard had discovered that real expertise wasn't about never being wrong, It was about being willing to learn from mistakes and value knowledge wherever it came from, whether that was a Manhattan sommelier, or a young waitress, or the experienced farm workers who were teaching him daily lessons about attention and care. The harvest would continue for another week, then the long process of fermentation and aging, and eventually they'd have wine to sell. But the product wasn't really the point anymore. The point was the work itself, the daily practice of creating something real and meaningful through patience and collaboration and humility. As the sun rose over the hills of Sonoma County, painting the vineyard in gold and orange light, Richard felt a contentment he'd spent his entire life chasing through money and status and performed expertise, and he finally understood that the best things in life required you to admit what you didn't know and learn from people willing to teach